Hello and welcome to the Rupeeting podcast once again. My name is Ayush,
I'm Sagnik.
and we are here once again this week with a different topic, a different industry, and a whole new outlook on a stock that we are about to discuss. Before we do that, I think the industry itself deserves a few minutes of discussion, and the industry being the Indian defense sector.
Right. It's a very shiny industry as of
Right.
it has always been a shiny and solid industry,
Yeah.
but it has recently been picking up a lot of pace. It has been
Right.
occupying a lot of space in the news headlines as well. So, and India has been making a lot of it has it has really ramped up its pace in the defense field. Even earlier it used to be government, but now we see private players like really gathering their space in this market.
Right. Like India's really making a name for itself in terms of the
Exactly.
defense from, let's say, not even 5 years ago, where we were barely a blip on the defense scale of things. But now I think just budgetary support from the government has increased by so much, where now 13% of the entire 2023 fiscal budget is allocated towards the defense sector, which is about what 6 lakh crore, and that
Right.
budget has what doubled in the past 5 or 10 years, which is massive. 6 lakh crores is a big amount, and a lot of it is going into making sure that India doesn't depend on any other country for any of its products, whether it's an aircraft or a submarine or a tank or even a mere nut and bolt that goes into any of these things. All of it must and will be produced within the country, and hence the immense amount of government push and support that's going into the defense sector. And I think it's showing, right? Like, I think we have some numbers on how much export India has been doing comparatively. If you could shine some light on that.
Exactly. So let's talk about 2017. We were about 1,500 crore export number. Yeah.
Yeah,
And right now, as of this year, we are at 16,000. That's like 16 times. And
16 times in 6 years is insane. Even if it's a
it's insane.
lower base and everything, it's still massive
India,
growth.
yeah. India really took the Make in India thing. I mean,
Seriously,
apart
yeah,
from everything else, they took
mm,
really seriously. I
yeah,
mean, like you said, nut and bolt. Like they're talking about, let's say, an aircraft. Earlier, it used to be 100% from foreign sources. Then it
yeah,
turned up to be 10. Then it turned to be 20. Now it's like 50% for most of the aircrafts. At least the majority aircrafts India has made,
yeah,
but they're planning to make it like 100% in the few years. And like currently, as per the news has to say, right now we are at 16,000, and in the next 2 years, they're planning to reach 35,000 crore export number.
so
So
that's more than double of what it is right
yeah,
now. Which is
that doesn't
possible,
even
right?
feel too much.
Considering the growth rate that we've achieved in the past 5, 6 years, doubling from
Yeah,
here won't be such a big deal. As you mentioned, also, since India is really in the news in terms of defense, whether it's being associated with export deals or being associated with the latest, I think, news article that has come out with the US India deal for exchanging information and tech on jet production.
yeah, right. So the deal was for like General Electric, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah,
General
General
Electric.
Electric signed a deal with India's defense sector for producing their engines.
Right.
I think it's a quite powerful engine. And apart from that, they also uh, like Russia and India had been in a very solid defense pact, and now there's a shift which we are seeing from
Right.
the Russian side to US side.
Right. And I think
Geopolitical
a lot of
issues.
that is exactly because of
Yeah,
the tension around the Russia-Ukraine war. A lot of banning and embargoes have been placed onto Russian imports. So a lot
right.
of the Sukhoi jets and everything, they're now being serviced by India rather than facilitating that
Russia.
Russia-India relation. And now switching sides to the US, quite a bold move and a big move at that, which is supposed to be very lucrative. And who else to give that deal than to our very own Hindustan Aeronautics, the
Exactly.
largest defense PSU of the country, responsible for what the some very very cool jets and helicopters that they manufacture.
Exactly. So all the new, all so we used to have what, like I said, it used to be 100% foreign before. All the
Yeah,
jets, all the wars they fought, it used to be 100% foreign. So our
yeah,
primary fleet was based off of the MiGs, which we often hear of, and the Mirage
yeah,
aircrafts and the Jaguars. That's
yeah.
the primary basis. But HAL came up with their own aircraft, which they started preparing in the 1990s, that era. They had that plan.
Right,
Now they finally came up with their own aircraft, and the Air Force is really like keen to take up all these aircrafts into their fleet and
right.
absorb all of it. So HAL
Yeah,
is a hot
so
cake right
HAL
now.
is really exactly HAL is a hot topic of discussion right now. More so because from an investor standpoint, the stock has given 106% returns in the last year and more than 300% in the past 5 years. So if any of you watching this have had HAL stock with you for the past few years, then you're definitely rejoicing and being super patriotic because of the India story that's panning out in terms of the defense sector. So yeah, coming to just the whole collaboration between the Indian government and HAL and a lot of these defense PSUs being part of the Make in India story for defense. So let's dive a little deeper on that. And I think since we mentioned imports already, for the viewers who may or may not be aware, uh, the Defense Ministry or the Ministry of Defense has come out with four lists of things that they've imported, banned imports of from a defense perspective. Cumulatively, I think that list stands at more than 2,500 items. And among them range from aircrafts and helicopters and armored vehicles to weapons, missiles, tanks, nuts, bolts, washers, anything and everything that India has the capacity to produce, they are stopping the import of. And this import substitution is just put in effect from 2022 onwards and will go on to 2029. So those four lists have a lot of detail in them in terms of what the item is and even more detail on who's going to be producing them among the 16 different defense PSUs that India has. And I think we have some numbers on that. Tejas, it seems. Tejas plain. The confusion happened because we have an intern named Tejas and there's a plane named Tejas, and the entire week has just been a series of unnecessary jokes on that front. But yes, Sagnik, if you could draw some light on what that situation is.
Yeah. So there are like what, six different companies. I mean, there are other companies too involved in the lists, but
Yeah,
there are six different major companies which you'll find in the lists which the government has released for the ban of different items, as I mentioned.
right.
As of that, the majority goes to Musgao Docks Limited, which are into submarine and ship related stuff. And then there's Hindustan Aeronautics, which have
Yeah.
bagged around 431 items which are to be indigenized.
Yeah. So just to give like context in terms of percentage, if Mazda talks and HAL together, they apparently make up what 50, 60% of the
Six,
entire order value just amongst the two of those companies. With
right?
Mazda Docs currently holding a larger share because the latest list, which came out I think a month or two ago, the fourth list has a lot of focus on the shipyard and submarine, just the naval segment in general.
Right.
But in terms of variety, I think HAL nails the bag there because I think 70% of the Indian Air Force's fleet, more than 60% of the Indian Navy, and entire fleet of the Indian Army is all governed by HAL, whether it's for repairs, maintenance, overhaul, production, whatever. HAL governs all three forces, while Mazadox is solely for the Navy. And I think that shows in general in terms of revenue numbers, profitability, order book, all of that. And I think if we have to talk about numbers, Just in the past 5 years, Mazda Ops has registered a higher revenue growth at 11%, while HAL was at 8%. But we'll get to why that gap was there for HAL and why they may have incurred
Yeah.
lesser revenue. But just on basis of profitability, 5-year PAT CAGR of HAL at 24%, while Mazda Ops was at 18. So there, HAL ticks the box. Operating margins at 25% for HAL with Mazda Ops at 10. And similarly for PAT margins, there's quite the large gap where HAL also wins again. So they've really been focusing on profitability. They have an order book that's maybe thrice the size of Mazda Docs, and they have a wider reach. So clearly, we had to choose HAL as the contender to discuss for the defense play.
Right. And if you see, their margins are quite high. I mean,
Right.
20%, 25%, that's quite high. And it has
Yeah.
sort of formed a really strong moat around the defense sector. You
Yeah.
talk about the coastal defense, they're there. If you talk
Yeah.
about the skies, they're there. If you want to fight in the mountains, they're still there. So no matter what kind of defense predation India sees, HAL is always going to be an integral part of it, driving the force.
Right.
So, and like HAL, like I said, started their plane research and development in the early 90s, something like that. And since then, it's been more of servicing the degrading aircraft fleet
Yeah.
because talk about MIGs, they have a really bad safety record. Like they've been involved in so many crashes in the last few years that their name has really gone down.
Right.
And so, to take care of this regularly depreciating fleet, HAL had to take up the role, and their repairing and overhaul services revenues have been growing a lot since the last few years. So that is there. But we believe the revenues are really going to kick in from the massive order book they have right now. They
Yeah.
probably have 82,000 crores
Yeah.
of order book right
82,000
now.
crores as of now. And I think they're expecting at least, and there are orders coming in
Yeah,
the pipeline that can make it touch a lakh growth, which
absolutely.
ironically is also the number of entire defense production that the entire country produced this year. So
Yeah,
you can see
true.
the scale at which HAL has really been performing or can perform in terms of execution. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
execution
well
has a
put
long way.
actually, because as you mentioned, a lot of the maintenance overhaul stuff was focused on more in the past 5 years, partially because they have been focusing on building the Tejas plane and pushing it out, and also because of the varied incidents of crashes or just grounding of planes that has happened in the past few
Right.
years that needed HAL's attention to be focused on overhauls. And I think just to put numbers to what you mentioned, that particular segment of HAL's revenue, I think, grew at what, a 50, what was the percentage of revenue growth?
You mean repairs, right?
Yeah, just that segment.
It grew for like 21% CAGR in the last four
Yeah.
years.
So if the entire segment, sorry, the entire company grew at an 8% CAGR, but this particular segment, which I think made up for around 10% of revenues before this 5 year span and now makes up a third of revenues. So
Exactly.
that not only has the revenue grown at a very high pace of 21% CAGR, but it's become a larger part of the entire mix as well. So yeah, interesting time in HAL's life, but of course, overall, it didn't affect revenues much because the manufacturing sector took a little bit of a hit. But we'll get to that bit in, I think, after we discuss the order book and the extents to which it spans. So if we can get some numbers on the order book, I think we have the past 5, 6 years worth of order book numbers, and it clearly
Yeah.
shows.
So order book has been, if you look at the manufacturing order book, it hasn't
Yeah,
been a lot of difference.
yeah,
But if you see the ROH, which clearly
yeah,
reflects in the revenue, it has
yeah,
grown a lot. And like we talked about, it's at 82,000 crores right now.
Yeah.
and driven by how much of India is willing to go heights to indigenize like completely all of their aircraft fleets and even tank fleets and everything.
Right.
So the Indian Air Force ordered, I guess, 83 aircrafts, which were made by
Yeah.
Tejas, which were
Yeah.
made by HAL back in 2021.
Yeah.
And they're going to be delivered next year, like early
They'll
next
go,
year around
I think the
March.
first few planes or the first,
First few, right?
yeah, will be delivered next year, and then over the
They'll
course
start
of
rolling
the
out.
next, yeah, exactly. So 6-ish years may they will execute the entire 83 plane
Yeah.
order of Tejas, which I think
So
each plane's around 300 crores, right?
yeah.
So
So the math's easy.
300 into 83, that's about 25,000 crores right there.
Yeah, add 25,000 to the order book and you come. So it's like that.
So that's brilliant, and I think that's not the end of the Tejas era because, as you mentioned earlier, the current fleet of the Indian Air Force, Navy, Army, the entire IAF, which spans at about what 500, 600 planes, 400, 500 planes right now, all of which are not able to sustain the span that the northern region of India requires in terms of safety. So
Mm.
apparently, according to the Ministry of Defense, at least an incremental 200 more planes are required in addition to whatever obsolete fleet there exists right now to actually be secure in the Chinese front and on the Pakistan front. So a total of 600 planes, out of which 400 exist and need replacement and 200 don't exist and need filling up. All of which is just the addressable market that HAL has to its disposal over what 20 years. I think they're 2040 tak,
20.
they're expecting all of these planes to be Tejas planes, which is their Mark 1. And I think we have a little bit of a, I think we were discussing how much better Tejas really is. So if you could give us some detail on that.
Yeah. So Tejas, why, like if you look at a bunch of things on the shelf and you see people picking out that one uh, thing in this kind of a market where every equipment is north of 150, 200 crores, right? Everything is.
Yeah,
So if you look at this international marketplace of defense equipments, Malaysia and other South Asian countries, even Egypt, they showed a lot of interest in HAL stages rather than other jets. Why?
right,
Because first, it is lightweight and it has a lot of hard points, which mean that the force and the pressure is defined really well along the structure of it. It has a really well it has a really high payload capacity and it can carry a lot of different kind of weapons. Simply speaking, like let's say there's a specific kind of missile US wants to use. There's a specific kind of missile Egypt wants to use. It can do both of them.
right. Which is
So
rare because no other plane right now is able to
yeah,
do that without and also be as light as the Tejas is.
right. And all that comes at a really nice, sweet price
Yeah,
because no other aircraft is like that cheap in this arena.
yeah,
So such countries are really showing interest in this, and of course, so and this thing is Tejas Mark One, I suppose, and there's going to be another version called Tejas Mark Two, which is basically the second generation version, and
yeah,
it's going to come out by 2025, 2026. Tab tak we can expect a totally working trial of the plane.
yeah.
And so right now we have the orders for Tejas Mark 1. Later on, like 5, 6 years later, all the orders are supposedly going to convert to Tejas Mark 2 if it's ready.
Right. And I think, as you
So
mentioned earlier, also with the US deal, I think the
yeah,
jet engine manufacturing co-production that's happening between General Electric and HAL is for their FA range and for our Tejas Mark II. So there
yeah,
is actual focus being given onto that, not just monetarily, but transfer of knowledge with such a high-powered defense contractor, which is the United
exactly.
States. So clearly, Tejas is in a good spot, and by product of that, so is HAL. So yeah, 82,000 crore order book, out of which most of it, or rather all of it, is aircraft centric and manufacturing centric. So about 75 to 78% is just the manufacturing orders. And right now, unfortunately, there aren't any export orders because there was news of a Malaysian contract in play, but somehow Korea beat India to it because of certain political and geographical differences where India was not
Yeah,
up to the mark as yet. But I'm sure with the new US India partnership, that will cease to exist. And a lot of other players, as you mentioned, like Egypt, then there's Argentina and the Philippines that are extremely interested, and that will play into building the export bit of the order book and reaching it to that 1 lakh crore mark in no time. Yeah,
exactly.
so
India has
that's about the
attached
order book.
itself to a
Exactly.
really big powerhouse, and it's going to be.
Absolutely.
It's just. It's just making it as shiny as possible.
Right.
Now, with how fast the economy is growing, like not to mention the vanilla term, but it is growing that fast,
Right.
and attaching it to a military superpower like US is a good step in making it like shielded very well. So
Exactly. So it has attached itself to a huge superpower. The economy of India itself is growing at north of 7% in the past year. Our budget is 13% of the entire total budget in terms of the defense allocation, which makes us actually the fourth largest, I think, globally in terms of the amount of spending that's going into the defense sector.
different.
We have a new plane that everybody wants to get their hands on, and we're actually becoming self reliant in terms of our defense
Yeah,
needs. So all in all, in the past 5 years, India and byproduct by that HAL has really stepped up and made sure that the Make in India process comes to fruition. And I think with all of these orders coming in, we can expect, if revenues have grown at an 8% CAGR in the past 5 years, there is an expectation of it going to double of that, which is 16%, because now is when the actual orders will get executed. Now is when the revenue for manufacturing will come in, while also the repair segment growing at a stable rate. So all in all, the past 5 years may have been great for HAL, but the next 5 years might just be even better.
exactly. And it is not even like it's just in the plans.
Right.
This company is ordering, this company is going to order that, that country might order this. They have
Right.
really amped up their production facilities as well.
That's true.
So they went on to, they could produce 12 aircrafts a year. And right now they're producing what, 20, 24,
24 almost,
24.
and eventually I think in the next 5 years with more capacity addition, it'll become 40 planes a year. And not
Yeah.
to like completely negate it, but their helicopters are pretty sweet too. And I think currently their helicopter manufacturing stands at about 60 helicopters a year, which was 30 5 years ago, and that 60 might become 90 in the next 5 or 6 years. So insane capacity addition happening over there as well. And I think when we were discussing HAL earlier, you mentioned that not only is HAL setting up production facilities in India, but they're doing it abroad as well.
Yeah, if that is, I mean, they have done a really good idea projecting this. I mean, if the other countries are going to order, I mean, it's not even, see, it's not even just the planes. It's not even just stages which they're going to export.
Yeah,
So there's a shit ton of engines. There's a lot of other mechanical equipment which they're exporting to different countries,
right,
and they are considering setting up factories in Vietnam and other countries of South Asia.
right.
So it's not just India; they're
Yeah,
really marking it globally. So
right. I'm sure that's possibly a to gain that sort of bilateral connection or bipolitical connection with these Southeast Asian parties. But I'm also sure that production there might be a little cheaper than it is in India. So
yeah,
HAL is really doing the cost efficiency bits there. Hence, we've seen the profitability rise. So this is all part of their future profitability efforts. And they're not just about the tech, they're not just about the defense, they're also about the numbers. So that's a win-win situation for the country and a win-win situation for the investor. And I think coming to the investor bits, if we are expecting that 16% CAGR revenue in the next 5 years, and let's say a profit after tax growth rate of 20%, that puts HAL in a very sweet spot to re-rate in terms of valuations. So clearly, I think right now, in terms of a valuation multiple, Tejas, sorry, again I said Tejas. I've been reading too much Tejas lately. The stock of HAL stands at a peg of 0.9 times, which is, I mean, according to, that's still a little bit higher than they have historically traded at, which is like a zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.6 times peg. And their 1 year forward P is a little higher right now, but they might just be justifying those higher premium valuations because, as you mentioned earlier, they've established that moat for themselves. They're the largest defense PSU. They have a global presence now in terms of being that name that everyone wants. And they have clear visibility in terms of this year में इतना revenue आएगा ही पक्का. And that number is much higher than it is right now. So it may just deserve those higher valuations, and based on our projections, which are obviously just an educational exercise, and none of what we have discussed throughout this is a recommendation. But if all of this does work out, the PEG ratio might just rate upwards to a 1, 1.1, 1.2 times, giving an upside of anywhere between 16 to 30% over the next longer term. So HCL is really poised for that good growth part of the entire story. And yeah, it's a good stock
It
to look
is.
into if you want to play the defense sector.
Has really good numbers as well, and it's a good play whoever wants to have a really good solid moat wala company in their portfolio
Right, exactly.
with such government backing and such clear visibility like you talked about.
Yeah,
Growth is pretty much inevitable. So
exactly. Exactly. Very interesting. I think even Mazgar Docks is quite an interesting stock, and maybe at some point later down the line, we'll be able to cover that stock because it's something that no one really talks about, like the naval side of things. How does
yeah,
even shipyards, like how does that system work? How does Indian submarine industry look like? Not no one really talks about those bits, and I think that's
you're
something
right.
that we can discuss later down the line. And it could just be another contender in the whole defense play of India because that stock itself has risen north of 200% in the past one
Yeah,
or 2 years. It's been quite the multi-bagger situation. And yes, defense good, HAL good, many stocks good. You all should look into defense. And yeah, I think that's about it for this week. Next week, we'll come to you with yet another interesting industry or stock to discuss. And until then, have a great week and look into the stocks we talk about because they really do well right after we talk about them. So visit all our previous podcasts, our blogs, and yeah, stay tuned for more. Thank you,
you
and that is a wrap.